Hello everybody, welcome to the first lecture on tissues. So let's start off by looking at this diagram of the levels of organization. We've talked about organization and we know how macromolecules come together to make cells. For example, we looked at the molecular composition of the plasma membrane. Well, now we're moving to the next level. Now we're going from cells to the tissue level. Right? And tissues are structures made of multiple cell types. And there's a little bit more to that, and we'll elaborate on that in a little bit, but that's where we are in terms of the organization of the body. So what we're going to do is we're going to start off by introducing the concept of tissues in general, and then we're going to focus in on a single category of tissues, the epithelial tissues. And we'll begin with the general characteristics of epithelial tissue before finishing up with looking at the specific characteristics of about half a dozen selected epithelial tissues. So let's go ahead and get started with all this. So a tissue includes two components. A tissue is a group of cells working together for a common function, and this material called the matrix, or sometimes it's called the extracellular matrix because it's located external to the cells, right? Now, this extracellular matrix is non-living. It's made of proteins and other macromolecules, and it is the stuff that fills the spaces in between the cells. So if we look at this diagram over here on the right, we can see that the yellow colored ovals are the cells, right? And all of the green and the black and the red and the purple stuff and the blue stuff, that would all be matrix, right? So these dark strands are matrix, the green strands are matrix, red stuff, purple stuff, blue stuff, all matrix. Now, we'll get more into matrix a little bit later. As we begin our talk of tissues, what I want you to keep in mind is that different tissues have different characteristics or capabilities. And the characteristics and capabilities, or the functions of a tissue, are based on its cells and its matrix. Right? Now remember, tissues are not the end of the levels of organization. Tissues, multiple tissue types will come together to form organs. Right? So organs are made of tissues. And organs are made with the tissues that give the organ the capability to carry out its job. And so the idea of tissues is kind of abstract, but remember that tissues are the building blocks or the building materials of organs. And I think everybody can appreciate that it's important for your heart to work right, and your lungs to work right, and your intestines to work right, and your kidneys to work right, or your muscles to work right. But the only reason that those organs, like your lungs and your muscles and your kidneys and your heart, work is because the tissues that they're made of and the ability of those tissues to carry out a particular function. Right? So there are four basic types of tissues in the human body. There are epithelial tissues, which generally speaking form coverings and barriers and can be involved with absorbing and secretion. Absorption is active uptake of materials. Now remember, the word active means that it's energy consuming, right? And secretion is active release. Right? And again, the word active means that it is energy consuming or requiring. Right? There's also connective tissues, which is a diverse group of tissues. They connect, they protect, they bear weight. Muscle tissue simply contracts, and by contracting produces movements or stabilizes joints or propels materials through your body. And then there's nervous tissue, which controls and regulates with electrical impulses and neurotransmitters. What we're going to do is we are going to focus in, at the beginning, on epithelial tissues. Okay? And we're going to talk about 5 or 6 specific types after we introduce some general characteristics. And then in the next set of lectures, we'll get into connective tissue, but only some of them. We're going to talk about muscle tissue when we get to the muscle system, and we'll talk about nervous tissue when we get to the nervous system. So we'll talk about tissues as we need to, rather than all up front. So let's talk about some characteristics of epithelial tissues. One characteristic of epithelial tissues is that they are very cellular. What I mean by that is epithelial tissue does not have much matrix. So I'm drawing some rectangles on the side of the screen, and each of these rectangles represents an epithelial cell. And you'll notice one is pressed right up against the other. There is almost no space between them. Epithelial cells are tightly packed together. Right? Another thing is that epithelial tissues cover or line surfaces. Right? For example, epithelial tissue covers the surface of our body because the external layer of our skin is epithelial tissue. Or if I was to draw a donut shape, imagine this donut shape represents your intestines. Right? There would be a layer of epithelial tissue lining its inner surface. Right? So your food would pass along the epithelial tissue lining the inner space, or the spaces in hollow organs are called lumen. And also in most of your small intestine, there's a layer of epithelial tissue covering its outer surface. And so we say epithelial tissue covers surfaces or lines surfaces. Because epithelial tissue covers or lines surfaces, it acts as, or it can act as, a barrier. And some of these barriers are designed to allow things through, and some of these barriers are designed to prevent things from coming through. What I'm going to do is on this diagram, am going to draw these little purple lines to represent the other tissue that the red epithelial cells are covering. Okay. The other thing about the epithelial tissue is it has what's called polarity. There is a top and a bottom to the epithelial tissue. The bottom, or the basal surface of the epithelial tissue, is the side of the epithelial cells that is fused to the other tissue that it covers or lines. Whereas the top surface is called the apical surface. Sometimes it's called the free edge because it's not fused or connected to anything. So this right here, this might be the space in your stomach, or the space in your nose, or the space in your intestines, or it could be the outside world, like the air around you, if these red cells represented epithelial cells of your skin. And so this having a top or a bottom, in other words being polar, that might not sound all that strange, but it is unusual among tissues. Now, it's attached to the material it connects to by what's called a basement membrane. And the basement membrane involves protein fibers that extend down from the epithelial cell membranes. And it also involves protein fibers that are reaching up from the tissue that it covers, and the green protein fibers from the epithelial tissue and these blue protein fibers from the other tissue, they kind of lock together like interlocking fingers to create what's known as the basement membrane. And the basement membrane is actually kind of important because it helps guide and direct the repair of damaged epithelial tissue. The fibers of the basement membrane actually make a mesh or a screen-like structure, which actually can influence the ability of materials like molecules to move up into or out of the epithelial tissue. There's even disorders that cause the basement membrane to degrade and cause epithelial tissues to slough and fall off what they're supposed to be covering. And then they don't act as barriers. There's actually a disorder where the basement membrane of your skin degrades and the skin of the infected or affected people sloughs off in big chunks. And as you can imagine, that's a pretty bad situation. Epithelial tissue is avascular. That means there is no blood vessels, no vessels up here in the epithelial, among the epithelial cells. Instead, the blood vessels that supply the epithelial cells are down here in the underlying tissue, and substances need to diffuse up into the epithelial tissues, and wastes and other things need to diffuse out, right? And oddly enough, epithelial cells are highly regenerative. In other words, they divide rapidly. Now, on one hand, this makes sense because epithelial tissues cover surfaces and are therefore subjected to wear and tear, and you would expect they would need to replace themselves regularly, right? But it is a little odd that a highly regenerative set of tissues does not have a direct blood supply, because typically you would expect highly regenerative tissues to be highly vascular, because it's the blood that carries the nutrients and building materials and oxygen to create new cells. Okay? And lastly, epithelial tissue is innervated. That means that there are nerves and sense receptors. Well, it's written down here. Nerves and sense receptors inside the epithelial tissue, which gives it the ability to, depending on the case, to detect chemical stimuli or mechanical stimuli such as stretch and pressure. Right? And I think this is a good place to stop. It's a good, and we will pick up on the next lecture or next video talking about how epithelial tissues are categorized, and we'll get into some specific examples.